these quotes, but I guess I'll read it myself then. The quotes when we get to it. Okay, but everyone has one of these? Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. Everyone's probably here, right? I guess it's 10 now. All right, let's stand and say a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you today about what Aristotle thinks place is, and I'm going to do that in the way in which I think Aristotle would describe it himself or justify his position. So what I'm not going to do is say talk about or lecture about how what we can make of Aristotle's position given, scientific developments. Okay, so if the universe is expanding, can you have natural place the way Aristotle thought of it? Probably not exactly in the way he thinks about it. Okay, or if but you can still hold some things. That would be very similar to what Aristotle holds, but I'm not going to really go into those questions. So we're not reading Newton's Principia, and we're not reading Einstein, and so I'm not going to try to rub Aristotle up against those different positions. Okay, really all I'm going to do is give to you what I think is Aristotle's justification for his position on what place is in the physics. Okay, now Aristotle begins his treatment of place by noting that all sensible things seem to be in a place. If you remember that. So everything that exists, he says, everything seems to be in a place. And the reason why he does that is because the physics, he says at the beginning of the physics that the order of our understanding goes from what's indistinct towards what's distinct. And that means it goes from what's more universal towards what's more particular. Okay, so we're able to distinguish between a tree and a bush before we can distinguish between a pine tree and an oak tree, before we can distinguish between a fir and a spruce tree. So we go towards, the way that our understanding goes is towards the more particular universal. Okay? And since the physics is the first book of natural philosophy, he's starting with what he treats of in the physics are what are the properties of natural things insofar as they're natural things. So he starts with what's most universal. So in the physics, everything that he treats of in the physics has to be able to be applied or a property of every natural thing. Every natural thing is in place, he says. That's why he's treating it in the physics. He doesn't treat of what's proper to, say, living things, like having a soul. He does that in the later books of natural philosophy, because living things are a more particular type of natural thing. Okay? So if you take the things that he treats of, all natural things have natures, all natural things exist in a place, all natural things exist in time, all natural things are continuous, so on and so forth. Those are the things he discusses in the book, The Physics. And he begins talking about place by justifying his treatment of it, and he does that by noting that everything seems to be in place. Okay? So, let's see. Now, if you look at your handout I gave you, you take that first quote. This is right from the beginning of Aristotle's treatment of the physics. Okay? And he says, one must try to make a consideration such as will demonstrate the what it is. That's what it is of place, define what place is. But that definition has to be so as to solve the difficulties and such that what seems to be place will be so. So what seems to be place has to be, your definition of place has to make what seems to be place actually place. Okay, so if the way you define place doesn't seem to line up what you think place is, then that's not a good definition, right? And moreover, so as to make apparent the cause of the perplexity and of the difficulties about it. For thus most beautifully would each thing be shown. Okay, so he says when we consider place, we have to make sure that we solve all the difficulties about it. What we think our definition lines up with what place seems to be. Okay, and it also is supposed to solve any perplexity that you have about it or difficulty that you have about it. Okay, and so what he does first then is he raises the arguments that would give you some difficulty about what place is, or even whether or not it exists. So this is kind of a common thing for him. He starts with what he might call a dialectical consideration, where he takes the positions of his predecessors and shows what they think about whatever the subject matter is and why they think it, and he lines them up all together, and through that he's able to see, okay, some people think this and some people think an opposite position. Well, what are their reasons for their positions? Okay, and so it's like in court when you have both a lawyer for a prosecuting lawyer and a defending lawyer. Okay, and that way you have arguments on both sides of the question, and then somehow our mind is able to see what's most likely true if we have arguments on both sides, where if we have arguments on only one side, our mind will be likely skewed. Okay, so what Aristotle does is he brings up difficulties, and these difficulties are really knots, because you have reasons to think one thing and then reasons to think another thing. And what he's saying here is, well, we need to establish what these difficulties are, and then we'll know that we have a good definition of place when it solves these difficulties, when it explains why people held the different positions that they held. Okay, so he does that in the first book. He does that here with place. Okay, all right. So I have another quote. So just to kind of show you that this is really what Aristotle does with almost everything, every subject he treats. He goes through this process. If you look at the second quote from the Ethics, he says, we must, as in all other cases, set the phenomena before us, and after first discussing the difficulties, so you discuss the difficulties, go on to demonstrate, if possible, the truth of all probable opinions about these affections, or, failing this, the greater number and most authoritative. For we resolve the difficulties and leave the probable opinions undisturbed. For if we resolve the difficulties and leave the probable opinions undisturbed, we shall have demonstrated the case sufficiently. So what he's saying there is you take the probable opinions of it, and that's going to be the opinions of his predecessors. Okay, so his predecessors who were wise men, the position that they held will be a probable position. And so what he wants to do is he wants to catalog the different positions that are held, see why they're held, and then if he can take a position that is in line with those probable opinions, or at least most of them or the most authoritative of them, he thinks he's done a good job in explaining what the thing is. All right. Okay, so what are the kind of arguments that he gives as difficulties? Well, the first thing he says is it's interesting. He argues that place actually exists. Okay, which is kind of funny why you would think that's a difficulty, but maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. He says it's obvious that place exists because bodies move. Okay, if bodies move, that means that they change place, which means place exists. But what also it does is it means that the place is something different than the body in the place. Okay, because if the body moves, that means the place that the body was before can't be the same as the body. Okay? So what it shows is that mutual replacement, or that bodies move, means that there's something besides bodies. And that something besides bodies we call place. Okay? The second reason he gives that place exists is that bodies seem to have a natural place. Okay? So heavy things go down, light things go up. So fire seems to go up, out towards the outer sphere. Its place is somewhere out there. Heavy things like earth, their place is down here. And so if things have a natural inclination to go somewhere, that somewhere has to be real in some way, he thinks, because it has this sort of power over bodies. So anything that has power over bodies determines the way they move, okay? Then it has to be something real, okay? But there's a difficulty when you then try to define what place is, okay? So Hesiod, one of his predecessors that he talks about, said the first being was chaos, and another meaning for chaos, or translation of that, would be gap or emptiness, okay? And the idea is that for anything to be, there has to be a place to put it in, okay? And so the fundamental being is just this empty, underlying, pure dimensions, okay? And that's these just pure dimensions, the underlying dimensions, what Newton calls absolute space, are a necessary condition for any bodily being. Meaning that you can't have a natural body unless you have a place to put it. And so if you take Hesiod's position of what place is, place becomes what Aristotle calls a marvelous or a wonderful thing. It's the first being, okay? It's at least the first natural being. You can't have any other beings without it, but it can exist without the other natural beings. So it doesn't depend on any other natural being, but all other natural beings depend on it. Therefore, it's the first being, okay? That Aristotle, he calls that a wonderful thing. It turns out he doesn't think that that's really the way it works, but that is maybe the first position, or one of the first positions you would take on what place is, and it's the position of Democritus before Aristotle, but also Newton after Aristotle. It's a very prominent position on what place is, okay? Now, when you take that position, though, one of the difficulties with that position is that it seems to be, it's often called nothing or void or empty, the emptiness. And Aristotle says the reason why you would think this position is because air, you might imagine it to be nothing because air doesn't seem to be anything. So if you remove all the desks and chairs and people out of this room, we say there's nothing left in this room. Even though there is something left in this room, there's the air. But kind of the way we speak about it, the way we think about it, because air doesn't really have the normal tangible qualities, we can't see it. Usually we don't feel it unless the wind's blowing or something like that. We kind of don't treat it as if it's a normal body, even though it really is. And so if you take all the bodies out of this room, what you're left with is still the room, which we think is the place. And then Aristotle basically thinks, well, we think that's the place, but we think it's empty, so place is just emptiness, the emptiness of everything, okay? But the problem with that position is that place can't be nothing, simply speaking, right? Because if you have that position where the void is not nothing, simply speaking, because it has dimensions. It has length, breadth, depth, okay? You can't have more or less of nothing, okay? So, but you can have more or less of this thing called void, okay? You can have a greater space, a smaller space. Or another way to put it, if there's nothing between two things, then they should be touching, right? But if there's void between two things, they're not touching. So if you take this position, really you're saying that there is this first substance, okay, that has nothing but just dimensions, All right, and that's the position of Newton. It's really, there's this first substance that has nothing but dimensions. But then you say, well, what kind of, it is a bodily substance, right? It is a bodily substance, these underlying dimensions, but then you put another body in it, and then whenever you have a thing in place, you have two bodies coinciding, which is a difficulty. You don't want two bodies coinciding in the same place. But if you think place is just these pure underlying dimensions, then you'll have two bodies coinciding. Okay. Okay, the second difficulty he brings up with this sort of thinking about place is it's not clear what it would be made out of. Okay, it would be different from all the elements. Okay, because the elements make the bodies we think of. Okay, but all the elements also have to exist in a place, and so this first underlying pure dimensional being wouldn't be made out of any elements because all the elements exist in place. So then what do you say? It's not made out of anything? That's a little bit strange. So it has to be a something, a substance, but then it can't be made out of anything because anything it would be made out of would have to exist in place. Okay? And then he also brings up the difficulty with this, which is it in some way is a cause of the other beings, insofar as pure space can exist without them, but they can't exist without pure space. So it's a cause, but it doesn't really fit with any of his four causes, and he doesn't like that. Okay, so he has four causes: matter, form, mover, maker, and end. And place in this sense doesn't seem to be any of them. Okay? And then he moves to a different position, and that's the position of Plato. And Plato's position is that place is the material of something, which is kind of strange. But the nice thing about this is that place doesn't have to be this sort of fundamental being. And the material of something has dimensions. And it's equal to the thing. The material thing which has dimensions is actually equal to the thing. And it seems to us that place is equal to the thing in place. Okay? So that would be kind of a property that's coming out here. Place, whatever place is, the place of something is always equal to the thing in that place. Okay? And for that reason, calling place the material of something seems to make sense for Plato, because the material of something is equal to the thing itself. Okay? The problem is, well, there are a number of problems with this position, but one of the fundamental problems is that place can be separated from a thing, but the material of a thing can't be separated from a thing. Okay? So and then there's one other difficulty, well, there's actually a couple others, but the other difficulty I want to talk about that he brings up is that, does place have a place? That's a question. Okay? If you say place has a place, which is Zeno's position, then would that place have a place? And so you kind of go back infinitely. Finally, it seems like place doesn't have a place, but he does bring up that position, that difficulty. Okay, now if we take all of these difficulties together, he kind of gathers a number of properties of place that we can take out of all these his kind of dialectical thinking about what did my predecessors think, why did they think this? Well, they thought this for these reasons, and that kind of brings to your awareness certain things that we think are true about place, and or properties of place, or attributes of place that are true of place, and that's good. And then so he lists a number of these, and by knowing what these are, it's going to help him determine what place is. Okay, and so I have some of these listed on your handout. But so one of the things he says is place is the first container of the thing in place. Okay. Okay. So place is said to contain the thing in the place. Okay. And the second thing is, because of the mutual replacement, because bodies move, you have to say place is something other than the placed. Okay? Place has to be something other than the thing in place. But place also has to contain the thing in the place. And then 3, the first place is equal to the thing placed. The thing in the place. Okay? Now, if you recall what he means by first place, so you have, if you say, in a way, you could say my place is the Newman room, or where are you? I'm at Thomas More College right now, or I'm in the Newman room, or I'm standing in the front of the room. Those are all common places insofar as other bodies share those places. Other bodies are at Thomas More College or in the Newman room. But the first place is the place that contains you and only you. Okay? So you have common places and you have more proper places, and they kind of narrow down. And he says, what's true is that the first place is equal to you. What he says is it's neither more than you nor less than you. Okay? So there is a way in which we speak about place. I am in the Newman room, that's my place. That's not equal to me, obviously, but that's the common place. But if you take the first place I'm in, that has to be equal to you. And then, okay, and then the last one he lists is every place is up or down to which bodies move by nature. Okay. Okay, so bodies, the idea is heavy bodies go down, light bodies go up. And so place has to be something that has power over those bodies and pulls certain bodies like earth down or fire up. And so place has to actually be up or down for Aristotle. Okay? But you can add 2 more of these. And that's one thing he said right at the beginning, every perceptible thing is in place. And then 6 is that place is immobile. Okay, that's also an attribute that comes out of his little dialectical consideration of place. Okay, this is kind of a hang-up sometimes because, if you think the universe is expanding, then place seems to be mobile. But really, it's kind of nonsensical to say place is mobile, because what that means is place changes place. Right? So you can't have place change place, obviously. So place, just of what it means, cannot be mobile. So however you define place, it has to be immobile to some extent. Okay. Now, then what he does is he says there are really 4 different things that place could be. It can be either matter, like Plato thought, or it can be form. Sometimes Aristotle calls it species, but what he means by form is shape, the shape of a thing. Okay, obviously he doesn't always mean that when he uses the word form in the physics, but here when he uses the word form or a species, he's talking about the shape of a thing. So it can be the matter of the thing, the dimensions of a thing, or its shape, or he says it's the underlying dimensions. Underlying. And then the third is, and the fourth is, he says it's the limit, the inner limit of the containing body. Okay? Now, These two immediately can be removed, right? These two can immediately be removed. They're nice because let me say, why would you think that either of these two positions? Well, one of the reasons is that they're both in some sense equal to the thing in place. Okay? Matter, like we talked about, is equal to the thing in place, the way place is. And form is equal. The shape of a thing is in a way equal to the thing in the place, the way that in capacity. So if you take a liter, or you say you have 1,000 milliliter bottle, the milliliters are the volume, right? But you call the bottle 1,000 milliliters because it has capacity to contain that much. Okay, and so that even though the bottle kind of shapes the volume, it's said to be equal to the volume in its capacity, and that in that way the shape of something is equal to the thing in place. It's equal to it in capacity. It's a slightly different meaning, but it seems to make sense. But you can do away with both these possibilities right away because both of them, neither of them are beside the thing in place or something other than the thing in place. So when you move something, it should move out of its place, but the form, the shape of something, and the matter of something go with it. So that just doesn't work. Okay? So really you have these two positions left. So he says it's one of these four. It's not. He easily argues that it's not these two. This is the one it seems to be most likely to be if it's not his position, and his position is that it's the inner limit of the containing body. Okay. Now, why is this position, that it's the underlying pure dimensions, or what Newton calls absolute space, why is that a probable position? Well, place would be really what coincides with the thing, what coincides of the underlying dimensions with the body. So the whole kind of empty space wouldn't be place, but the first place at least, but really the part of that coincides with the body, right? And so in that way, it would be equal to the thing in place, which is one of his properties. It's also something other to the thing, other than the thing in place. So that's good. It's also immobile. So that's good. So it has at least those three characteristics. Still, it's not really a container of the thing in place. Meaning, if you think of place as just pure space, the body isn't really in it. Okay? What the body does is it coincides with it. But you speak of the water in the jar, or Mr. McCarthy in the Newman room. And it seems like when we talk about place, you should be in the place. Okay? But if you take Newton's position or Democritus's position, the body isn't really in the place in that sense, it's really coincides with it. Okay, so there's a certain difference there. So yeah, what would in mean? It means coincide. But the other thing that Aristotle says to refute this position is he says this position implies that you have an infinite set of actually existing places in the same place. Okay, this is kind of the hard argument to understand. But what you do is if you take a jar, which is what he says, and there's water in the jar, and you shake it, okay, there has to be a place for all of the different locations and configurations of the water in the jar. Okay, and since it goes through all these different positions as you shake it, there's an infinite set of different places the water takes. Okay, but all of those places have to be actual at the same time. Because with this consideration of place is something totally independent of the body in it. Okay, it underlies it, it exists whether or not the body's there. And since there has to be a place for every position of the body, that place has to be there whether or not the body's there or whether the body's there or not. Okay? Because the underlying dimensions are completely independent of the thing in the place. And for that reason, since you can take my phone and move it around and it has an infinite set of different locations, there has to be a place for each one of those locations. And since that place isn't made actual by the phone being in it, right? Because the body is independent, because the underlying dimensions are independent of the phone, they all actually exist there always. So you have a simultaneous infinite set of existing places all at once in the same place and in every place. So just like there's an infinite set of places for my phone here actually existing, there's an infinite set of places for my phone here actually existing, and so on and so forth. Okay? And that he thinks is absurd. Okay? He doesn't think that's the way you have to think about it, but he says it's a necessary implication of holding the view that that place is some sort of pure dimension that underlies every body and is separate or distinct from the bodies. And like we said before, it also implies that you have two bodies coinciding in the same place, because the dimensions have to be a body and the body itself has to be a body, so you have two bodies in the same place, which he also thinks is not possible, or at least very strange. Okay? Okay, is everyone okay with that? It's kind of an odd argument. He gives another argument that you would have to say points are in place just like bodies are in place. There's no reason to say if you think it's just pure underlying dimensions and it's what place is really the part or the portion of the dimension that coincides with the body. Well, you also would have the ends of the body or the limits of the body coinciding with different points or lines or surfaces in the absolute space. And so they would all have places too. But then he says if you take the end of a body, if you take the end of the body as the surface, the end of that surface is a line, the end of that line is a point. That point would be something real and would be part of the body, but there'd be nothing to distinguish that point from the point that it coincides with in space. They'd really be the same point, because the only thing that distinguishes two points are their location, but they'd share the same location. Okay. All right, it's kind of a funny argument, but we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so basically he doesn't think this is a possibility either. So he says the only possibility is his position. It's the inner limit of the containing body. Okay. So how does he justify this? He says, well, notice that if you ask where something is, we give a body as an answer. Okay, if you say, where is something? The answer is a body. Okay, so you say the water is in the cup, or Mr. McCarthy is in the chair, or in the room, or in the country. All of those things are bodies. The cup is a body, the chair is a body, the room is a body, the country is a body in some sense. So now, so it seems like when we answer the question of where something is, we give a body, which seems to mean place should be some sort of body. Now, but we also think that the body that we're talking about is the body that contains the thing. Right? So when I say I am in the chair, that's because the chair is containing me in some sense. Okay? So that's just how we speak about it. So we speak about it, we speak about place when we answer the question, where is something, as if it is a containing body. Okay? And as you say, I am in the Newman room because the air is in the Newman room and I'm in the air, right? Would you say, I'm really not in the whole air, specifically as my first place, but I'm in the air insofar as the inner limit of the air contains me. And so that's his position. The place is the inner limit of the surrounding body. Okay? Now, that makes place equal to me in capacity. Okay? And that goes back to, remember what he really talks about later in Book 5, how when things are touching, their endpoints coincide. Okay? So the inner limit of the containing body, the air for me, is in the same location as my shape. Because when two things touch, the end of them coincide. Okay, so the end of my finger coincides with my other finger, the end of my other finger, if they're touching. You know, if you say there's void in between the molecules or something like that, then they're not really touching, right? But if you suppose that they're really touching, then really what you're saying is the end of one coincides with the end of the other. Okay, because you can't have two surfaces be next to each other, as we learn in Book 5. Okay. So, the inner limit of the containing body is equal to the thing placed. Okay? It's also something other than the thing placed. It also contains the thing placed. Now, whether it's up or down, we can talk about that, but that goes back, you have to understand this, you have to understand the way in which he thinks it's immobile. Okay? So he also thinks that place is immobile. So what was my number 6 that I didn't write down? Every perceptible thing is in place. That's almost right for Aristotle. There's a problem with that, whether the outer sphere would be in a place because there's nothing that contains it, and then whether place is immobile. Okay? So let's read this last quote. So the question is, the fundamental question is, how can, if I say the inner limit of the containing body is the place, how can I say it's mobile? I mean, it's immobile. Because it seems as if the inner limit of something can move. Okay? So this is what he says. However, just as a jar is a transferable place, so is place an immovable jar. Whence what is within moves and changes in a moving thing, as a ship in a river. It uses the container more as a jar than as a place. One intends place, however, to be immobile. Whence the whole river is more the place, because the whole is immobile. And then he says, whence place is the first immobile limit of the containing body. And that's his final definition. Place is the first immobile limit of the containing body. Now, so the odd thing is he says the whole river is more the place, because the whole is immobile. So he deliberately chooses an example of something, the river, which is both mobile and immobile. Okay? Because you can never step into the same river twice. That's Heraclitus. The river is always flowing, so it's always moving in one sense. Okay, so it's mobile. But in another sense, it's not moving. Insofar as its shape, it somehow maintains its identity because its shape remains the same, and its location relative to the banks or to the center of the universe or to the outer sphere, if you're Aristotle, always remains the same. Okay? As long as the earth isn't moving, which would complicate things. But just pretend that the earth isn't moving like Aristotle thought. You say the river that way isn't moving, right? Insofar as its position relative to something unmoved, like the center of the universe, is not moving, and its shape stays the same, so it maintains its identity that way. Okay, even though materially, the different material that makes up the river, the water, is always changing. Okay, and so if you have the phone here and the wind is blowing by, you could say, in a way, the inner limit of the containing body materially is changing, because it's different air that's coinciding with the shape of the phone. But it's still immobile the way that a river's immobile. Okay? the location relative to something unmoved, like the center of the universe, would be unchanged, and the shape of it would be unchanged. And that's the way in which he says place is immobile. Okay? It's really kind of this strange thing, but I think it works, because I do think we consider the river to be immobile in some sense, even though it's always moving. There's a way in which it is, a way in which it isn't. And he's saying that's the way that place is immobile. Okay? All right. The other thing that's nice about this is the place doesn't have to exist actually when the thing's not in the place. Okay? So the place of my phone here is only potentially there until I move my phone there. Then it's actually there. Okay? So if you want to bury someone in the ground, you have to dig a hole. Okay? So the place for the corpse isn't in the ground yet until you make it. Right? It's not actually there until the body goes there. Okay? So that means you don't have to have, like you do with the underlying dimensions, an infinite set of places in the same place actually. There's always only one actually there. Okay? Now, he says one of the signs he gives that his meaning of place is the right meaning of place is that we don't really consider parts in wholes. We don't normally speak of them as if they're in a place. So you don't really say that. You say my finger is part of my hand. It's not really the place of my finger. My hand isn't the place of my finger. Okay? Or the pupil is part of my eye, but it's not really the place of the eye isn't really the place of my pupil. At least we wouldn't normally speak that way. But he says once you divide it, once something's actually divided, then we say it's in the thing as in a place. Like when you say wine is in a wineskin. It's not part of the wineskin, but it's in it. Then you have a strict division, an actual division between the wine and the wineskin, and then a containing limit, an inner limit of the containing body, the wineskin, being the place for the wine. And so if if you actually make a division, you take a tooth and you break it off in your mouth, then actually the mouth would be the place of your tooth if you have the real division there. But if it's continuous, then it's really a part and a whole. And the distinction there is whether or not the division is actual or just potential. And by making the division actual, he says, then you make the place actual, which is a sign that the place is made actual by making the division, which makes the place the division between the two bodies. Okay? All right. So, place is immobile. You do not have to have an infinite set of places existing together. Okay, you don't have to have place exist as pure non-being, but you also don't have to have it exist as this sort of fundamental being upon which all other things depend to exist, which it doesn't seem to be. You don't have to kind of posit this sort of marvelous existence to place as if it's almost godlike with his position. Okay, you could kind of think about this as with using Occam's razor as a principle, or the simplicity principle. Why posit the existence of this thing that we never experience directly, that would be quite astounding, really, the sufficient condition the necessary condition for all other beings to exist, underlying ineffable, infinite substance, when you don't have to? Okay? So if you use Occam's razor to it, you say, well, you can account for what we talk about as place without positing this thing that we never experience directly as that it exists. So why would you posit that this thing exists? Okay? So there's that positive, that's strike in Aristotle's favor. Okay? Place can have a position. Place is something besides the thing placed. Place is equal to the thing in capacity. And because it's in immobile, it has an absolute position up or down. So some places are up, some places are down. Okay? All right. So that's basically Aristotle's account of place. He kind of ends by solving a few difficulties. He talks about whether or not, say, the outer sphere can be in a place. And he says technically it's not, because there's nothing outside of it to contain it. You don't have to say there is something outside of it. Obviously, we probably don't believe in the outer sphere. I don't, but it's a problem for him. If you think about, you could talk about, if the universe is expanding, the end of the universe is the end of the universe in a place, right? And for Aristotle, he would say it's not. Though in a way it is, because its parts are potentially in a place. So because you could take the parts of the outer sphere and divide them from the rest of the outer sphere, then the outer sphere could kind of contain those parts, at least to some extent. And so in that way, since all of its parts are potentially in a place, he says the outer sphere is accidentally in a place. The way that, say, the color of something is accidentally in a place. Okay, the color isn't really the thing placed, it's the body. But because the color exists in the body, you can kind of say the white thing is in a place. But it's not the white as such that's in the place, it's the body. Okay, or it's not my soul that's in a place. Is Aristotle's example, but it's my body that's in a place. Okay. Okay. Are there any questions? Mr. Kaiser?
Could you go over the relationship between space and place? Because I think many times when you're speaking about place, I'm picturing space, and I don't think I have some confusion about it.
Okay, so there's the two distinctions there. There's the distinction between, say, what would be Democritus's position, on what places, or Newton's position on what places and what spaces. And the place of something would be the portion of space in their position that the body coincides with. Right? So you can have space without having place, meaning if you have just the emptiness, there's space there, but there's no place there really until a body is coinciding with it. Then it would be the place. Okay. Or, well, I should say this. The place would be that portion. I think, Aristotle thinks you would actually have to say that the place is actually there, but you'd say what you mean by place is not the whole space, but just the portion of space that coincides with the body. So that's in Newton's position or Democritus's position, which is who Aristotle's thinking of. But if you're Aristotle, then there isn't something as sort of this underlying space. You have the dimensionality of the material, the length, breadth, depth of the material, and then you have the shape of that material, and then you have the inner limit of the containing body, which coincides with that shape, and so that would be the place. And there isn't this pure existing space. So did that? Yeah, not a pure existing space. What you do have dimensionality, obviously, but only dimensionality in bodies. Or another way to think about this is you don't have one dimensionality, which is the pure space, and then your body, which has its own dimensionality, and those two dimensionalities existing together, or two bodies existing in the same place. You don't have that for Aristotle. He thinks that's kind of, he basically says, I don't know what he would say was wrong with that exactly, but he says you can't have two bodies existing in the same place. So either he thinks it's strange, as he sometimes says about things, or he thinks it's just contradictory. I'm not sure you'd say it's contradictory, but it certainly is strange. Okay? All right, no other questions? Yeah, Ms. Dashka.
Does it have place as a body? Is that what you're saying?
No, so it's not a body. For Aristotle, it's really a limit of the containing body.
Okay.
Right?
So would the dimensionality be a body?
Yeah, so every body would have dimensionality, meaning length, breadth, depth, right? And the body in the place has dimensions. The place of the body is equal to those dimensions in capacity because it contains them perfectly. Yeah. Yeah, Mr.
Also,
Kaiser.
you said something, I don't know if Aristotle said this, but you said place has power over bodies.
Yeah.
Is that odd to you?
Yes. Yeah. It's still odd. It's still odd. Yeah. So what I say is, it makes more sense to say that with Aristotle's position, it seems to me, because you actually have something in contact with the bodies, the place, that somehow is able to move it.
Well, what about the place that's keeping the bodies? Wouldn't that have power over? I mean, that would sound like there could be no movement in a way because everything is in a place. What's preventing the place it's currently in from keeping it in motion to another place?
Well, because the bodies have inclinations for not all places equally, is Aristotle's position, right? There's an intrinsic inclination of heavy bodies to be at the places down, and light bodies to be at the places up. And it's their nature to be in those places because somehow those places are good for the body.
So I have to say it's just a specific, like there's a natural, one natural place for these bodies. But I mean, when he says broadly speaking place, it sounds like
Every place.
Every place.
Well, yeah.
Power over.
No, I think he's saying what he was saying is so he uses that argument in the context of showing that place must be something. We have to talk about it as something because some places seem to have power over bodies. Therefore, if something has power over something else, that thing that has power has to exist. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can't. If you can't really hold exactly Aristotle's position on that anymore. It seems to me, because when you get close enough to the moon, you don't fall towards the Earth anymore. You start falling towards the moon. So it's not a specific position that's inclining your body to go somewhere, but what is much more likely, it's the heavy body, and we tend to go. So it's body's nature to go towards other heavy bodies, not to go to some place. It seems to me. So you'd still have a natural inclination in some sense, but to move, but it wouldn't be the place, an absolute place that determines that. I just don't see how you could reconcile that with classical physics and parts of classical physics that seem to me to be undeniably true. Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful.